They were masters of the plains, skilled hunters who knew every track, every wind. But the tracks they found weren't natural. The howl they heard wasn't wolf. When the werewolf attacked, the Cheyenne faced a terror demanding more than courage. It demanded they hunt down the darkness itself. Do you want to know how this story began and how it will end? Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and let's dive into this story. The Great Plains stretched under the immense sky like a breathing hide, vast and teeming with life. For generations untold, the people, the Tsitsistas, known to others later as the Cheyenne, had lived in harmony with this land. Their painted teepees stood clustered near a winding creek, smoke curling lazily from the smoke holes, carrying the scent of cook fires and drying meat into the crisp air of late summer. This was the time before the great herds of horses would forever change the rhythm of the plains. A time when life was measured by the sun's journey, the changing seasons, and the success of the hunt. Matto, whose name meant bear for the strength in his shoulders and the quiet way he moved, watched his son, CHEYENNE, practice with a small bow near the edge of the camp. A smile touched Matto's lips. The boy was learning, his small brow furrowed in concentration, just as Matto's own often did when tracking elusive prey. His wife, Kaya, worked nearby, scraping a buffalo hide stretched taut on a frame, her movements practiced and efficient. This was the heartbeat of their life. Family, community, the provision gifted by the land and the spirits. Yet, in recent weeks, a subtle disquiet had begun to weave itself through the usual peace. It wasn't something loud or obvious, more like a shift in the wind's tone, a shadow lingering too long at dusk. Hunters returning from the thick woods that bordered the eastern edge of their usual territory spoke of game trails gone strangely cold. Deer, usually plentiful, seemed to have vanished. Even the rabbits were scarce. Old Nahko, whose eyes held the wisdom of many winters, claimed the air itself felt watchful. Matto, too, had felt it. Days earlier, while checking his snares near the edge of those same woods, he'd found tracks. Not deer, not elk, not wolf or coyote. They were huge, impossibly large, the claw marks digging deep into the soft earth, as if pressed by immense weight. He'd circled them, frowning, his tracker's mind unable to place the beast that made them. There was a wrongness to them, a distortion of the natural order he knew so well. He mentioned it quietly to the other hunters, who nodded grimly, having seen similar signs themselves. They spoke of strange sounds drifting from the trees after sundown, not the familiar calls of owls or the yip of coyotes, but something deeper, guttural, that made the dogs whine and flatten their ears. Tonight, the air felt particularly heavy. The usual evening sounds of the camp, laughter, storytelling around the fires, the rhythmic tap of Kaya's scraping tool, seemed muffled, subdued. The setting sun painted the sky in strokes of angry orange and purple, colors that felt more like a warning than a blessing. CHEYENNE had abandoned his practice, drawn close to the family teepee, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by a quiet anxiety that mirrored the adults. Matto scanned the darkening tree line far across the creek bed. The woods looked like a solid wall of blackness, impenetrable and secretive. He shook his head slightly, trying to dismiss the unease as foolish fancy. They were the people. This was their land. What was there to truly fear? He drew Kaya and CHEYENNE closer as they settled near their small fire. the familiar warmth a small comfort against the growing chill and the nameless worry that seemed to gather with the deepening twilight. The wind whispered through the tall grass, and for a moment Matto thought he heard something else carried on it. A low, drawn-out sound, almost like a distant howl, but deeper, rougher. He strained his ears, but it was gone, lost in the vast silence of the plains. Sleep did not come easily. The strange weight in the air persisted, pressing down on the camp. Dogs, usually quick to bark at any night sound, whimpered softly, huddling close to the dying embers of the fires. Matto lay awake inside the tepee, his hand resting on the hunting knife beside his sleeping mat. Kaya slept fitfully beside him. Cheyenne curled between them. Every creak of the tippy poles, every sigh of the wind against the hides, made his muscles tense. He told himself it was just the unsettling talk, the strange tracks feeding his imagination. He tried to focus on the familiar, comforting smells of smoke and worn leather within their lodge. Then it came, not the whisper on the wind this time, but a sound that ripped through the night's stillness. A blood-freezing howl, closer than seemed possible, filled with a raw savagery that spoke of nothing natural. It was immediately followed by screams, sharp and terrified, from the edge of the camp near the woods. Matto was moving before conscious thought took over, grabbing his knife, pushing through the tippy flap into the chaotic darkness. Fires flared as people stumbled from their lodges, eyes wide with panic. The air filled with shouts, the terrified barking of dogs cut short by sickening crunches and yelps of pain. And then he saw it, briefly silhouetted against the flickering light of a disturbed fire pit. A shape, taller than a man, broader than a bear, moving with impossible speed. It wasn't walking on four legs like a wolf, nor upright like a man, but somewhere horribly in between. A hulking, hunched form covered in thick, dark fur. Its head too large, its snout too long, teeth glinting wetly. Chaos erupted. Figures ran blindly, tripping, screaming. The creature lunged, a blur of dark motion, claws like hooked knives tearing through hide lodge covers as if they were paper. A warrior rushed forward with a spear, only to be swatted aside with contemptuous ease, his cry cut short. The sound of splintering wood, tearing hides and guttural snarls mingled with the terrified shrieks of the people. Matto saw it grab a dog and break its neck with a sickening snap before tossing the body aside. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, filled with a terrifying predatory power. He shoved Kaya and Cheyenne back towards the center of the camp, shouting for others to gather to protect the children. He saw other warriors emerging, armed with spears and war clubs, trying to form some kind of defense. But the creature was too fast, too strong. It moved through the panicked camp like a dark whirlwind, striking seemingly at random, its terrifying howl echoing between the teepees. Matto felt a primal fear clutch his heart, colder and deeper than anything he had ever known. This was not a bear defending its territory or a cornered wolf pack. This was something other, something ancient and malevolent unleashed upon them. He raised his knife, positioning himself between the monstrous shape and his fleeing family, his knuckles white. The creature's head snapped towards him, its eyes glowing with a faint, terrifying luminescence in the dim light. It let out another roar, a sound that vibrated in Matto's bones, and took a step towards him. For a heart-stopping moment, their eyes locked, predator and prey. Then As swiftly as it had appeared, it seemed to hesitate. Perhaps the growing number of armed warriors gathering, perhaps some unknown whim, made it turn. With another deafening howl that promised future torment, it bounded away, clearing the creek in a single impossible leap and vanishing back into the black moor of the forest, leaving behind a scene of wreckage, blood, and utter terror. Silence, heavy and stunned, fell over the ravaged camp, broken only by the weeping of the terrified and the groans of the wounded. The dawn broke grey and cold, revealing the true extent of the night's horror. Tepis lay torn and collapsed, belongings scattered, the ground stained dark in several places. Warriors moved grimly through the camp, assessing the damage, their faces masks of shock and anger. 2 dogs lay dead, their forms twisted. Miraculously, no one had been killed, but several men bore deep, vicious wounds, claw marks that looked unlike any natural animal could inflict. Kaya worked alongside other women, tending to the injured, her face pale, but her hands steady. Cheyenne stayed close to her, his young eyes wide with the trauma of what he had witnessed. Fear was a tangible presence, thick as smoke, clinging to everyone. People spoke in hushed whispers, eyes constantly darting towards the silent, watchful line of trees across the creek. The confidence of the people, their sense of security in their own land, had been shattered in a few terrifying minutes. This was not a raid by another tribe, nor an attack by a known beast. This was something outside their understanding, something that spoke of dark magic and ancient evils. Chief Black Kettle, his face edged with worry, called the council. The warriors, the elders, and Matto gathered in the center of the shaken camp. The air was heavy with unspoken fear and the need for answers. Old Nako spoke first, his voice raspy with age and dread. "No natural beast does this," he stated gravely. "The tracks, the sounds, the way it moved. It is an old darkness, one spoken of in whispers by our grandfathers. A spirit of the deep woods, perhaps, angered." Then spoke Enepe, the shaman, his eyes closed as if listening to unseen voices. He was gaunt, his face painted with sacred symbols. "It is more than spirit," Enepe said softly, his voice carrying an eerie weight. "It is flesh and blood, yet bound to shadow. It carries the curse, the shape changer, the man who walks as wolf, the wolf who hunts as man, the werewolf." A collective gasp went through the gathered men. The name itself held power, a forbidden thing rarely spoken aloud. "What do we do?" a young warrior asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Do we move the camp? Flee this place?" "Flee where?" another countered bitterly. "This creature is faster than any horse. It came from the wood, but who is to say it would not follow?" A fearful silence fell. Moving the entire camp was a monumental task, leaving familiar grounds for the unknown. And there was no guarantee of safety. Matto stood. The image of the creature's glowing eyes burned into his mind, the memory of its roar still echoing in his ears. He thought of Cheyenne's terrified face, of Kaya's quiet strength, of the wounded men groaning nearby. "We cannot run," he said, his voice low but clear, cutting through the fear. "This thing attacked us, in our home. It tasted blood here. It will return if we show weakness. It must be hunted. It must be destroyed." His words hung in the air. Hunt it? Hunt that? The memory of its power, its terrifying speed, was fresh in everyone's minds. "It is unnatural," Enepe warned, opening his eyes, which seemed dark and deep. Arrows may bite, spears may wound, but its life force is strong, protected by the curse. It will be dangerous beyond measure. "We are hunters," Matto insisted, looking around at the faces of his fellow warriors. "We track the buffalo, the bear. We know the ways of the wild. This is a predator, even if unnatural. It bleeds. It leaves tracks. It can be found, and it can be killed. We must show it that the people are not easily broken." Chief Black Kettle looked at Matto, then at the worried faces around him. He saw the fear, but also the flicker of hope in Matto's determined eyes. He nodded slowly. "Matto speaks truth. Running will not save us. We must face this darkness. Matto, you will lead. Choose your bravest, your keenest eyes and strongest arms. Enepe will bless your weapons. Go into the woods. Find this howling death. End its reign of terror before it returns for more." A grim determination settled over the council. The decision was made. Matto chose 4 warriors. Takoda, the silent, peerless tracker. Kichi, young but incredibly strong and brave. Elan, the fastest runner. And Waya, the best archer among them, whose arrows rarely missed. As Enepe chanted ancient prayers, painting protective symbols on their arms and blessing their arrows and spears, Matto felt the weight of his people's survival settle onto his shoulders. He looked towards the dark woods one last time, then turned to his small band. There was no turning back now, as the sun climbed higher, painting the ravaged camp in stark light. The 5 warriors, armed and blessed, left the relative safety of the open plains and stepped into the shadows of the whispering forest. The moment they crossed the creek and stepped under the canopy of the ancient forest, the world changed. The vast open sky of the plains vanished, replaced by a dense ceiling of leaves that filtered the sunlight into shifting, uncertain patterns on the forest floor. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves and pine needles. Sounds became muffled, swallowed by the trees. The familiar prairie wind replaced by hushed whispers and the sudden snap of twigs underfoot that sounded unnervingly loud in the stillness. Matto led the way, his senses straining, every nerve alive to the unfamiliar environment. Takoda moved beside him, his eyes constantly scanning the ground, missing nothing. Kichi, Elan, and Waya followed closely, their initial bravado tempered by the oppressive atmosphere. They were men of the plains. This deep wood felt alien, enclosing full of unseen watchers. Takoda soon found the tracks leading away from the creek bed where the creature had landed after its impossible leap. They were horrifyingly clear in the softer ground near the water. Huge clawed prints pressed deep, confirming the beast's immense weight and power. There was a strange irregularity to the gait, reinforcing the unnatural melding of man and beast that Enepe had spoken of. They followed the trail deeper into the woods, moving with the practiced silence of seasoned hunters, yet acutely aware that this time the prey they stalked was unlike any they had ever encountered. Hours passed. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of ancient trees, tangled undergrowth, and sudden shadowed clearings. The tracks led them relentlessly onward, deeper and deeper into territory none of them frequented. They moved slowly, cautiously. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking threat. Every rustle of leaves made them jump, hands tightening on their weapons. The silence itself was unnerving, broken only by the occasional cry of a distant bird or the chattering of a squirrel. sounds that seemed too normal for the palpable tension that surrounded them. Matto felt the weight of responsibility pressing down. The lives of these 4 warriors, the safety of his entire tribe, rested on his decisions, on their success. He pushed down the tendrils of fear that tried to coil in his gut, focusing instead on the task, on the tracks, on the subtle signs Takoda pointed out. A broken branch too high for a normal animal, a patch of disturbed earth, the sheer violence evident in the path the creature had carved through the underbrush. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows through the trees, Takoda suddenly stopped, holding up a hand. He knelt, pointing silently. There, beside a cluster of ferns, lay the savaged carcass of a large buck. It hadn't been killed cleanly for food. It had been torn apart, ripped limb from limb, with a fury that spoke of pure, malevolent rage. The sheer brutality of the scene sent a fresh wave of cold dread through the warriors. This was not just a predator hunting for sustenance. This was a killer driven by bloodlust, a force of destruction. The air around the kill site felt heavy, tainted. Wire muttered a prayer under his breath. Kitchi gripped his war club tighter, his knuckles white. Ilan scanned the surrounding trees nervously, his speed useless if attacked by surprise in this dense terrain. Matto looked at the carnage, then back at the tracks leading away from it. The creature was powerful, vicious, and somewhere ahead of them in this darkening wood. He exchanged a grim look with Takoda. The hunt had just become terrifyingly real. They checked their arrows, tightened their grips on their spears, and pushed onward into the growing gloom. The image of the mangled deer burned into their minds, a stark warning of the fate that awaited them if they failed. The woods seemed to deepen, the shadows coalescing, and the silence felt less like peace and more like the held breath before a scream. The light was failing fast now, the filtered sunlight turning to a dim, grey twilight that made shapes indistinct and treacherous underfoot. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation. The warriors moved even more cautiously, placing each foot with care, their eyes straining to pierce the deepening shadows. The tracks were harder to follow in the fading light, but Takoda's skill was uncanny. He led them onward, guided by overturned leaves, subtle impressions in the moss, the faintest signs invisible to lesser trackers. Matto felt the shift keenly. They were no longer just hunters tracking prey. They were intruders in a domain ruled by something ancient and terrible. And the feeling of being watched intensified with every step. The hair on the back of his neck prickled constantly. He could feel the eyes on them, unseen, patient. He signaled for the group to slow, bunching closer together for mutual protection. Wire kept his bow half drawn, an arrow nocked, his gaze sweeping the dense thickets around them. Suddenly, from somewhere ahead and to their left, came a sound that froze them in place. A low, guttural growl, vibrating with menace. It wasn't distant this time. It was close, dangerously close. Instinct took over. They flattened themselves against tree trunks, seeking cover, weapons ready. Silence descended again, absolute and terrifying. Matto strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the growl, his heart hammering against his ribs. Where was it? Was it circling them? Waiting? Then, with explosive force, the undergrowth directly in front of them burst open. A dark shape, immense and impossibly fast, launched itself towards them. It wasn't a charge. It was a flowing, terrifying leap, covering the distance in a heartbeat. Matto only had time to register a flash of yellow eyes, a gaping maw filled with dagger-like teeth, and the overwhelming stench of wet fur and old blood before he threw himself sideways. Chaos erupted in the small clearing. Elan, true to his name, dodged backward with incredible speed. Kitchi roared a challenge, swinging his heavy war club in a wide arc, more to ward off the beast than with any real hope of connecting. The creature twisted mid-air, landing with a heavy thud that shook the ground, its claws tearing gouges in the earth. It swiped contemptuously at Kitchi's club, sending splinters flying, the force of the blow nearly wrenching the weapon from the young warrior's grasp. Wire loosed an arrow. The shot was true, aimed at the creature's massive chest, but the beast twisted with unnatural agility. The arrow struck its shoulder, sinking deep, eliciting a furious howl of pain and rage. It barely seemed to slow it down. It spun, its glowing eyes fixing on Wire, and lunged again. Dakota reacted instantly, shoving Wire hard, sending him sprawling backward as massive claws ripped through the air where he had just been standing. The creature snarled, turning its attention back to the group, momentarily distracted by the arrow still protruding from its shoulder. It seemed more enraged than injured. Matto saw his chance. While it was focused on Wire and Dakota, he lunged forward, knife held low. He wasn't aiming to kill, just to wound, to drive it back. He slashed at its flank, the blade biting through thick fur and tough hide. The creature roared again, a sound of pure agony and fury, and spun with blinding speed, knocking Matto off his feet with a powerful backhand blow that sent him crashing into a tree trunk, stars exploding behind his eyes. Before it could press its advantage, Kitchi charged again, club swinging, forcing it back a step. Elan helped Matto stagger to his feet, his head ringing. The werewolf glared at them, blood dripping from the arrow wound and the gash on its flank, its chest heaving. Its eyes burned with malevolent intelligence. It had assessed them, tested them, felt their weapons. Then, as suddenly as it attacked, it seemed to decide the fight was over for now. It let out one last, chilling howl, a promise of return, and melted back into the dense forest, vanishing into the deep shadows as if swallowed by the night itself. Silence slammed back down, broken only by the ragged gasps of the warriors. They stared into the darkness where the beast had disappeared, trembling from adrenaline and terror. Kitchi helped Wire up. Dakota retrieved his arrow, grimacing at the dark, thick blood coating the shaft. Matto leaned against the tree, catching his breath, the pain in his side sharp where he'd hit the trunk. They had survived. They had wounded it. But the brief, terrifying encounter had stripped away any remaining illusions. This was no mere beast. It was cunning, incredibly strong, resistant to injury, and filled with a terrifying rage. They were deep in its territory, wounded, and night had fully fallen. The hunter had definitively become the hunted. Fear, cold and sharp, settled deep into their bones as they huddled together in the oppressive darkness of the werewolf's wood. The immediate aftermath of the attack left them shaken but resolute. The creature's blood trail, darker and thicker than any natural animal's, was now their guide. Wounded, it might be slower, perhaps seeking refuge. They had to press the advantage, however slight it might seem, against such a foe. Waiting for dawn felt like suicide. The beast knew where they were now. Moving through the pitch-black forest was treacherous. Only Takoda's instincts and the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy allowed them to follow the sparse droplets of blood staining the leaves and moss. Every snap of a twig sounded like the creature returning. Every gust of wind through the branches seemed to carry its menacing growl. The forest itself felt alive, hostile, its shadows filled with imagined terrors alongside the real one they pursued. Matto pushed down his own fear, focusing on keeping his warriors moving, their spirits from breaking entirely. Elan scouted slightly ahead, his quick eyes trying to pierce the gloom, while Kitchi and Wire guarded their flanks, weapons constantly ready. The blood trail led them upward, onto a rocky ridge sparsely covered with twisted pines. The air grew colder here, the wind whistling mournfully through the rocks. Takoda paused, sniffing the air, then pointed towards a dark fissure in the rock face, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. A narrow cave entrance. The smell emanating from it was overpowering. A foul miasma of decay, damp fur, old blood, and something else, something indescribably wrong. Bones, bleached white and splintered, littered the ground near the entrance. Deer, elk, and unsettlingly smaller bones that looked disturbingly like those of large dogs, perhaps even coyote or wolf. Its den, Takoda breathed, his voice barely a whisper. Matto felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. This was the heart of the beast's territory, its sanctuary. Was it inside now, nursing its wounds, waiting? He signaled for silence, listening intently. He could hear nothing from within the cave, but the drip of water somewhere deep inside. Enepe's words echoed in his mind. Bound to shadow, the man who walks as wolf. He looked up through a gap in the pines. The moon, nearly full, hung high in the sky, bathing the ridge in an eerie, silvery light. Did the moon give it power? Or was its form constant, a permanent curse? The shaman hadn't been clear, perhaps not knowing himself. But the rising moon felt significant, ominous. They couldn't afford to wait. If it regained its strength, if it emerged again under that cold moonlight. We don't go in, Matto decided quickly, his voice low. It knows that cave. We would be trapped. We wait for it here, or we draw it out. They needed a plan. A direct assault was madness, as the earlier encounter proved. Their only advantages were their numbers, however small, their ranged weapons, and their human intelligence. An ambush. That was the only way. There. Takoda pointed to a narrow game trail leading away from the cave entrance, the only clear path down the ridge. It must use this path. They quickly surveyed the area. A cluster of large boulders overlooking the trail offered cover and a vantage point. It was risky. The creature might scent them, might choose another way. But it was their best chance. If they could hit it hard and fast with multiple arrows as it passed below, they might overwhelm its unnatural vitality. Wire, Matto instructed. You and Elan take the high rocks there. Wait for my signal. Aim for the chest, the head if you can. Wire nodded grimly, checking his bowstring. Elan, though visibly nervous, took his position, spear held ready in case the arrows weren't enough. Kitchi, you stay with me behind these boulders, Matto continued. If it gets past the arrows, if it charges, we are the last line. Kitchi hefted his war club, his jaw set. Takoda would stay slightly back, ready to use his own bow or knife, his tracking skills invaluable if the beast somehow evaded them again. They settled into their positions, melting into the shadows of the rocks, the cold stone seeping into their weary bodies. The foul scent from the cave drifted on the wind. The moon climbed higher, casting stark shadows. All they could do now was wait, listening to the wind, the pounding of their own hearts, and the terrifying silence from the dark maw of the werewolf's lair. Every nerve screamed with tension. The fate of their tribe rested on the next few moments, on the accuracy of their arrows, on their courage in the face of the howling death. The waiting was its own form of torture. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each heartbeat echoing loudly in the tensed silence. The moon climbed higher, bathing the rocky ridge in cold, revealing light that felt more exposing than helpful. Every shadow seemed to twist into monstrous shapes. Every gust of wind carried imagined growls. Matto forced himself to remain still, breathing slowly, conserving his energy. His focus narrowed down to the dark cave entrance and the narrow trail below. Beside him, Kitchi shifted his weight, the leather of his moccasins whispering against the rock. Matto could feel the young warrior's tension, a coiled spring ready to snap. Up on the higher rocks, Wire and Elin were motionless silhouettes against the moonlit sky, bow and spear held ready. Dakota remained a deeper shadow nearby, alert and watchful. Doubt began to creep into Matto's mind. What if the creature was too wounded to emerge? What if it had another exit from the cave, unknown to them? What if it had somehow circled around behind them? He pushed the thoughts away. They had followed the blood trail here. This was its lair. It had to emerge eventually. But the waiting gnawed at them, amplifying their fear, draining their resolve. A cloud drifted across the moon, plunging the ridge into near-total darkness for a few moments. The tension ratcheted up instantly. Was it moving now, under the cover of blackness? Matto strained his ears, listening for any sound. A dislodged pebble, a heavy breath. Nothing. The cloud passed, and the eerie moonlight returned, revealing the cave entrance still dark and silent. He glanced at his warriors. Their faces, illuminated by the moon, were pale, strained. How much longer could they maintain this high alert before exhaustion dulled their senses, slowed their reactions? He knew they couldn't stay here indefinitely. If the creature didn't show itself soon, they would have to risk a different approach, perhaps trying to smoke it out, though the thought of facing it in the confined space of the cave was terrifying. Suddenly, Dakota stiffened, holding up a hand almost imperceptibly. Matto followed his gaze. A small pebble had skittered down the slope near the cave mouth. Then another. Silence. Had it just been the wind? Or... A low growl rumbled from the darkness within the cave, deeper and more menacing than before. It wasn't the sound of pain now, but of rising anger, of gathering power. Matto's heart leapt into his throat. He signaled silently to Wire and Elan above. Ready. Slowly, cautiously, a massive head emerged from the blackness of the cave mouth. Long snout, pointed ears, eyes that seemed to glow with their own internal, hateful light. It tested the air, sniffing, its gaze sweeping the ridge. Did it sense them? Could it smell their fear? It took a step out onto the trail, then another. The moonlight revealed the arrow shaft still protruding from its shoulder, though it seemed less hindered by it now. The gash Matto had inflicted on its flank was dark and clotted. It looked huge, impossibly menacing in the stark moonlight, its thick fur bristling, muscles bunched beneath the hide. It paused, scanning the rocks where Matto and Kitchi hid, then looked up towards Wire and Elan's position. For a heart-stopping moment, Matto was sure it knew they were there, that it would charge directly at them, bypassing the kill zone. He tensed, gripping his knife, preparing for the onslaught. But then, perhaps deciding the open ridge was too exposed, or simply heading towards familiar hunting grounds, the creature turned and began to pad silently down the narrow game trail, directly towards the ambush point below Wire and Elan's perch. Matto held his breath. Now. He gave the silent hand signal. The twang of Wire's powerful bowstring cut through the night air, sharp and clear. An instant later, a second arrow followed from Elan, who had been given a bow by Wire as backup. Both shafts flew true, aimed at the center of the massive chest, lumbering down the trail. The werewolf let out an explosive roar of shock and agony as the arrows struck home, sinking deep into its thick torso. It stumbled, catching itself on the rocky path, its head whipping around towards the source of the attack on the high rocks. Another arrow from Wire zipped past its head as it moved. Instead of collapsing, the creature seemed energized by the pain, fueled by an unholy rage. With terrifying speed, ignoring the arrows embedded in its body, it abandoned the trail and scrambled directly up the steep rock face towards Wire and Elan's position, claws finding purchase on impossibilities, moving with the agility of a monstrous insect. "Now, Kitchi!" Matto yelled, breaking cover. He and Kitchi charged down towards the base of the rocks, hoping to intercept the creature, to draw its attention away from the exposed archers above. Dakota moved with them, bow ready. Wire and Elan desperately tried to reload, but the beast was too fast. It reached their ledge in seconds, swiping viciously. Elan cried out, dropping his bow and barely dodging backward as claws ripped through his leather tunic, drawing blood. Wire managed to get off one more shot at point-blank range, hitting the creature's leg, before he was forced to abandon his bow and draw his knife, bracing for the onslaught. The werewolf, snarling, focused on the two warriors trapped on the narrow ledge. This was the opening Matto needed. "Dakota, aim for the head!" he shouted, fitting an arrow to his own bowstring even as he ran. He and Dakota loosed their arrows simultaneously. Matto struck the creature's thickly muscled back. Dakota's glanced off its skull with a sickening crack, momentarily stunning it. Kitchi reached the base of the rocks and began scaling them with reckless bravery. His war club held high, roaring a challenge to draw the beast's fury. The werewolf, momentarily dazed, shook its massive head and turned, its glowing eyes fixing on the new threat below. It snarled, abandoning the warriors on the ledge, and launched itself downwards towards Kitchi. It landed heavily between Kitchi and Matto, the impact jarring the ground. Kitchi met its charge, swinging his club in a powerful arc that connected solidly with the creature's side. There was a wet crunch, and the werewolf howled, staggering back, but Kitchi's momentum carried him too close. A massive paw lashed out, claws extended, catching Kitchi across the chest, sending him tumbling backward with a strangled cry, his club flying from his grasp. Matto fired again, his arrow sinking into the creature's already wounded shoulder. Dakota fired too, aiming for the throat. The beast roared, blood now streaming from multiple wounds, arrows protruding like grotesque spines, but it refused to fall. It turned on Matto, its eyes burning with pure hatred, saliva dripping from its jaws. This was it. No more room for arrows. Matto dropped his bow and drew his long hunting knife, bracing himself. The werewolf lunged, a terrifying whirlwind of claws and teeth. Matto dodged sideways, slashing desperately at the reaching claws, feeling the shockwaves as they tore through the air beside him. He stumbled back, tripping over a loose rock. The creature loomed over him, jaws gaping for the kill. He saw its throat, thick and corded, exposed for just an instant. From the ledge above, Wire, seeing his leader about to die, hurled his knife with desperate strength. The blade spun end over end, striking the werewolf in the side of the neck, burying itself deep. The beast choked, staggering back, pawing at the knife hilt. It wasn't a fatal blow, but it bought Matto the second he needed. He scrambled to his feet as Dakota rushed in, knife flashing, creating a diversion. Matto saw his opening, the chest already pierced by Wire and Elan's arrows. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, he lunged forward, driving his own knife deep into the creature's heart. Pushing with all his strength, twisting the blade, the werewolf let out a final ear-splitting shriek, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the night. It shuddered violently, its glowing eyes flickering. Its massive body convulsed, clawing at the air. Then slowly, agonizingly, it crumpled to the ground, landing with a heavy, final thud. Silence. Absolute, deafening silence, broken only by the ragged, desperate gasping of the surviving warriors. For a long moment, nobody moved. They stared, breathless and unbelieving, at the massive, still form lying crumpled on the rocky ground. Steam rose from its dark fur in the cold night air, mingling with the metallic scent of its unnatural blood, which pooled darkly beneath it. Arrows protruded gruesomely from its torso, shoulder, and leg. Wire's knife was still embedded in its neck, Matto's buried to the hilt in its chest. Slowly, cautiously, Matto pulled his knife free, wiping the thick, dark blood on the creature's own fur. He nudged the massive head with his foot. No reaction. The glowing embers in its eyes had faded, leaving only glassy, dead orbs staring sightlessly at the moonlit sky. It was over. The howling death was dead. A wave of bone-deep weariness washed over Matto, so profound he nearly collapsed. Adrenaline drained away, leaving behind aching muscles, the sting of cuts and bruises, and the hollow echo of terror. He looked around at his men. Wire and Elan scrambled down from the ledge. Elan clutched his torn tunic, blood seeping from shallow claw marks on his shoulder. Wire looked pale but unharmed. Dakota retrieved his arrows, his usual stoic expression softened by relief. Kitchi lay groaning on the ground where the creature had thrown him. Matto rushed to his side. The claws had torn through Kitchi's leather shirt, leaving deep gashes across his chest, bleeding profusely, but miraculously seeming to have missed anything vital. "Kitchi, speak to me," Matto urged, pressing his hand against the worst of the bleeding. Kitchi coughed, his eyes fluttering open. It is dead?" he rasped. "It is dead," Matto confirmed, relief flooding him. "We did it!" They worked quickly then, driven by the need to get Kitchi and Ellen back to the camp and the shaman's care. Using strips torn from their own clothing, they bound Kitchi's wounds tightly, trying to staunch the bleeding. Elan's wounds were less severe, painful but not life-threatening. Dakota examined the dead werewolf one last time, a look of grim satisfaction mixed with awe on his face. Bringing back the head or claws as proof seemed impossible given its size, and their need for haste with the wounded. Their word and their survival would have to be enough. The journey back through the forest was arduous and somber. They took turns helping Kitchi, who leaned heavily on Matto and Takoda, drifting in and out of consciousness. Elan gritted his teeth against the pain in his shoulder. The forest, which had seemed so menacing on the way in, now felt strangely empty, silent, as if acknowledging the defeat of the unnatural presence that had haunted it. Yet, the memory of the terror remained, a chilling presence in the back of their minds. They were forever changed by what they had seen, what they had fought. As the first hints of grey light began to streak the eastern sky, they finally emerged from the oppressive darkness of the woods and onto the familiar open plains. The sight of their camp, teepees standing silently in the pre-dawn light, was the most welcome thing Matto had ever seen. Anxious figures were already stirring, peering towards the woods. A cry went up as they were spotted, ragged, bloodied, supporting their wounded comrade. But alive, people ran towards them, Kaya at the forefront, her eyes scanning Matto anxiously, before falling on the injured Kitchi. Chief Black Kettle and Enepe met them as they stumbled into the center of the camp. "The beast?" the chief asked, his voice tight with hope and fear. Matto looked him in the eye, exhaustion lining his face, but his voice steady. "The howling death is dead. We killed it." A collective sigh of relief swept through the gathered people, quickly followed by murmurs of awe and concern for the wounded warriors. Enepe immediately set to work on Kitchi and Elan, applying poultices and chanting healing prayers. Kaya brought water, her hand briefly squeezing Matto's arm, her eyes conveying relief and pride that needed no words. The story of the hunt, the terrifying encounter, the ambush, and the final desperate fight was told in fragments by the weary warriors. The tribe listened in hushed silence, their fear slowly replaced by awe at the courage displayed, mourning the near losses, but celebrating the victory over the darkness that had threatened to consume them. Later, as the sun rose fully, bathing the plains in the golden light of a new day, Matto stood at the edge of the camp, looking back towards the dark line of the forest. Peace had been restored, won at great cost. His body ached, his spirit was weary, but his people were safe. The memory of the glowing eyes, the impossible speed, the terrifying roar would never truly leave him, or any of them who had faced the creature. The story of the howling death, and the warriors who hunted it down with arrows and courage in the moonlit woods, would become part of the people's legends, whispered around campfires for generations. A chilling reminder of the thin veil between the known world and the ancient darkness that sometimes sleeps and sometimes wakes beyond the firelight. And tell me what you thought of the story. Did you like it? If so, leave your like and a comment to help the channel grow and bring more stories like this every day. Subscribe to the channel and see you in the next video.